The Sony A1 II. Is it Sony's best flagship camera yet, or a disappointing upgrade? So the Sony A1 II is obviously an upgrade from the Sony A1, and it doesn't have any entirely new features inside it. A lot of the features you see in the A1 II you've already seen in the Sony A7R5 or the Sony A9 III. That's not a bad thing though, they've just incorporated a lot of newer features from newer Sony cameras and put them into a flagship camera, which is great overall. If you're looking to get either the Sony A1 or the A1 II and price isn't an issue, honestly, just get the A1 II. It's an objectively better camera. It's got everything the A1 does, plus more. Just get the A1 II. Now the body on this camera is more resembling the A9 III than it is the A1, so it does not fit the A1 battery grip, which isn't a huge loss. The battery grip on the A1 was always sort of awkward placement with its dials, especially if you're shooting vertically. So it's great that you have the A1 II, which fits the A9 III battery grip, which is just a better all designed battery grip. Other things about this camera in terms of design is you also have a full-size Ethernet port, a full-size HDMI port, and what I think is probably the coolest thing about this camera, it has a vari-angle tilt screen. So this screen can also flip out like a typical vari-angle screen and tilt up like a photographer's screen. So it's great to have the best of both worlds in this camera, a hybrid of screens. It's fantastic. I want to see this in other cameras. Another important thing to note about this screen is if you're wearing polarized sunglasses, you will not be able to see the screen when rotating the camera into a vertical position. You'll just see a blank screen, as the camera itself is also using polarizing technology. So think of this as like when you go to the train station, you cannot see the screen with polarized sunglasses on, as the two objects are both using polarizing tech. This is a pretty big issue to me, as I think a lot of photographers will want to protect their eyes, so they are going to be purchasing polarized sunglasses, and not being able to actually see what's on the screen when you rotate to a vertical position, a very common position. That's a problem to me. But thanks to Nathan for spotting this issue. He's a photographer. We're going to be talking to him later about this camera, but until then, let's keep going. By the way, these aren't polarized sunglasses. These see aliens. The battery life on this camera, I didn't do anything too crazy in testing. I did leave it running for a little over 1 hour at 4K and it didn't overheat. Worked great, that's gonna be great for conferences. And we did take this camera out in 28 degrees Celsius heat and shoot at 30 frames per second, as well as, 4K video, and we're shooting outdoors, really hot. And the camera didn't get an overheating signal until like a little over 2 hours in. So that's a great bit of testing. It's great to know this camera can work in high heated conditions, especially if you live in Australia right now where it's a bloody oven. But the image quality is the next most important thing about this camera, and you do have great image quality here. You have 50.1 megapixel CMOS stacked sensor. Fantastic. We all love having a shitload of megapixels, don't we? And in terms of video, I'm impressed by the video in this camera. It's H.265 422 10-bit. To give you an idea, that just basically means you have a whole lot of colors and great dynamic range inside this camera. And it also records in S-Log3, which is better than S-Log2, as S-Log3 means you get more details in the shadows of your video. There is a bit more of a risk of more noise coming in, but all in all, it's great to have, more detail in the shadows, as often if you are shooting with a Sony camera, you're not necessarily always shooting with a whole lot of crazy lighting. You might just be shooting, in natural lighting. So S-Log2, H.265 422 10-bit, great sort of color range to be working with in video. In terms of the video frame rate, we're working at 8K 30p with an oversampling of 8.6K and 4K at 120 frames per second. Now, I know some of you are probably going, oh, why isn't 8K at 60p? The R5 II can shoot in that, and some other random Nikon camera can shoot in that. But honestly, who is going to be shooting 8K 60p? It's just a ridiculous amount of memory, resolution, processing power. If you're shooting at that higher level, you probably are investing in a dedicated video camera. That being said, it's great to have the options here. I think the video is fantastic inside the Sony A1 II, but I do think this camera leans more towards being a photographer's camera, if I'm being totally honest. This camera can shoot at 30 frames per second, and it does have a pre-release of 0.3 to 1 second. So all in all, it's going to be a great camera where you don't have to sort of time out your shots as much as you would with other cameras. So you don't necessarily be missing that perfect moment thanks to this camera. It's great range to sort of have. Outside of that, just overall good image quality on this camera. I also got to use the all-new 28-70 GM lens, and if you're wondering why that isn't a GM2 lens, well, because Sony hadn't released a 28-70 GM lens until now. And this lens, while it is just called GM, it does have all the features of a GM2 lens, so it does work just as well as a GM2 lens. And honestly, that change from 2.8 aperture to 2 is beautiful. It makes such a difference, a great glow to it. I love the aperture on this lens. It's a great build lens, very lightweight, very easy to use. Might not necessarily pair it with the A1 II, as I do think this camera is more for like longer lenses anyway, you know, birds and athletes. But all in all, it is a great lens and I'm happy I got to use it. Now let's talk about my favorite feature on this camera, and that's the AI autofocus. And Sony has some of the best AI autofocus on the market. This camera is fantastic with its AI autofocus. It's very sticky, very persistent. You can have someone run in front of your focused subject and the autofocus will latch right back onto that person's eye within less than a second. It's fast acting autofocus, sticky autofocus, and also you do have your standard, you know, subject detection where you can take a photo of someone's face and it'll go autofocus every time I see that person's face. Great autofocus overall. And a great range of subject detection. So of course you can detect people, but you can also detect vehicles, insects, dogs, animals, birds. Great range, and that's one of the best things about this AI autofocus is just that broad range of subject detection. In terms of like subject detection range, I wasn't anything too crazy. It wasn't like I was grabbing a bird at 400 meters away. I mean, yeah, if you have a long lens, you will be able to grab autofocus on animals a lot more easily, but it's not grabbing a small animal in a shot or a small person in a shot. But I will say that I did find the autofocus did operate on people much better than any other object when it was operating at a significant distance. It was able to grab a person's face from a fair way distance. So that's pretty damn cool in itself. Overall, it's a great autofocus and it still works great even when the camera has been shaking. And if you're working like, say, sports photography or birds and stuff, it's great to have that autofocus be that level of stickiness. Now that being said, if you're using long lenses, the stabilization in this camera is also pretty damn good. It's 8.5 stops, so that's a great sort of stabilization to be having in this camera. In terms of video, yeah, the autofocus is very persistent and the stabilization, it's fine. Like, I'm gonna put this on the gimbal anyway. I always put my cameras on gimbals. Now the pricing on this camera is basically, it is a flagship camera, so you are dealing with a flagship pricing. Can't give you any specific pricing as I do work at digiDirect and we do have more sales than EB Games, so you know, prices do fluctuate. But regardless, you are probably gonna have to sell your kidney if you wanna hold one of these cameras. But it's really a professional use camera. It's not an entry-level camera in my personal opinion. It is fairly easy to use, but if you're buying this camera, it's either because you want to get the absolute best Sony images or, you know, you're a professional photographer and you're making money off this camera. All in all, in terms of pricing, there has been a change. The A1 is now cheaper and the A1 II is now the price that the A1 originally was. So now you have a choice. Do I get the A1 at a permanent discount or do I get the A1 II at the original price of the A1? And yeah, just get the A1. The same price as the A1 originally was, or just get the A1 II, it's the same price as the A1 originally was. So you're getting that. Of course, if you want to save money, you can also just get the A1. And it's really a question for people who are upgrading from the A1 to the A1 II. Is this A1 II going to be worth the few extra grand you spend on it after selling your A1? Personally, I do think it is. You do have that AI autofocus that's not in the A1, and some people are going to go, why is it not a firmware update? I don't know, but it's never going to be a firmware update in the A1. And also the A1 II does have that vari-angle tilt screen. So the AI autofocus and the vari-angle tilt screen, those are so cool features. I do reckon those are worth the few extra grand you'll be spending on this camera. And if you're someone that actually hates the idea of selling your A1 camera, fortunately you can sell it to us at digiDirect through DG Seconds. We'll evaluate the camera, we'll give you a voucher right here and then for the camera, and you don't have to have this camera sitting on your shelf or have to deal with any online sales or haggling. You know, we'll just take the camera off your hands, you'll get the money, and you can buy the A1 II as soon as possible. Now, I am more of a videographer than a photographer, and I did want to get the opinion of a photographer when it comes to the A1 II, as I do believe this camera leans more towards photography than it does videography. I got in contact with Nathan, who specializes in photographing rescue animals at the Blacktown Animal Rehoming Center, and he has worked with the Sony A1 and the Sony A9 III, which are very close to the Sony A1 II. So here's what Nathan thinks of the Sony A1 II.
I originally shot with the A1 Mark I now, purely for the fact that 50 megapixels means I can crop in from a long distance. I mainly shoot on a 70-200, but when you have a dog barreling towards you at like 30 kilometers an hour, you kind of have to get out of the way relatively quick. So with the 50 megapixel, it lets me crop in from a big distance and still have a very usable 24 or so megapixel image for social media. When comparing the A1 Mark I to the A1 Mark II, the biggest difference for me is the new multi-axis screen. I came to love that screen on the A7R5, but unfortunately the A7R5 can't quite keep up with fast moving objects. 10 FPS just simply isn't enough for what I do. So on the A1 Mark II, I still get that 30 FPS I love from the A1, but I get that beautiful screen I love from the A7R5. Being able to shoot portrait properly without having to kind of, move the camera out in front of me too much is great. I typically shoot from a position like this. I get nice and low. Having that screen where I need it is perfect. On the A1 II, I kind of have to do that. And as you can see, my angle is terrible. I can't really push it out too far. That's a huge one for me. Other would be the introduction of the, custom drive mode dial, little star. I have no idea what Sony calls it, but for me, I normally will shoot in mode 1, 2, or 3. I set that up for like my portrait, my action, my landscape. Don't do a lot of landscape. So when I switch between 1 and 2, having the drive mode dial set to that star lets the camera change my drive mode for me. So in mode 1, I can be on say 5 FPS. I switch to mode 2, all of a sudden I'm in 30 FPS. I don't have to remember to come back here and change my drive mode dial. And that has ruined me a couple of times on the A1 Mark I. Comparing the A1 Mark II to the A9 III, which I've had the pleasure of shooting probably 200,000 odd photos on, the megapixel increase that you get on the A1 Mark II, it can't be understated enough. 24 meg is nothing to kind of, bark at. But when you're shooting animals, you crop all the time. I don't have the luxury of being able to frame an animal. I'm kind of just at their mercy. They're running, they're jumping, they're stopping. Cropping is something I do with every single shot I take at a shelter. So having 50 megapixels versus 24, it just lets me keep a hell of a lot more shots. Love the A9 III, love shooting at 60 FPS all day, but I would rather have 30 at 50 megapixel than 60 at 24. Comparing the autofocus on the Mark I versus the Mark II, I'm not going to say night and day. I would say probably like a 50% increase. It'll definitely pick up subjects a hell of a lot further than the A1 Mark I can. I can grab a dog from say 30, 40 meters away with the Mark II. It'll grab that eye, it'll stick on it as the dog's barreling towards me. The A1 Mark I is just as sticky, but the subject acquisition on the Mark II is infinitely faster. Having that auto subject detection feature is also quite handy. In a lot of situations, I found the animal focus on the A1 Mark I would still kind of default to humans. So if I'm getting a shot of say a handler holding an animal, the A1 Mark I would oftentimes kind of jump up to the handler's eye, even in like a very small spot tracking mode. On the A1 Mark II, I can set my auto priority between humans and animals, but prefer animals, and 9 times out of 10, does the job. In terms of things I would have liked to see on the A1 Mark II, a couple more FPS would have been great. 30 is all well and good, but 35, 40 would have just been that icing on top of the cake, but I can make do with 30. The updated body design on the Mark II obviously follows the A9 III's footsteps and no complaints whatsoever. Again, I've been lucky enough to shoot the A9 III since launch. Having that little bit of extra space is just awesome. I've got quite large hands. I kind of have to shoot gripped, otherwise my pinky is just kind of floating around. I'm not the biggest user of the C5 function button on either the A9 III or now the A1 Mark II, but having it is still better than not having it. Just that couple extra millimeters you've got kind of everywhere makes a difference for me at least.
So that's the Sony A1 II, and all in all, I do think there's been a fair amount of bitching about this camera on the internet. A lot of people going it's a disappointment or it's underwhelming for an upgrade and all that. But honestly, it's brought some of the best features from other Sony cameras and put them inside a flagship camera. Yeah, there is an argument to be made that some Sony cameras, they do need to have more firmware updates with their cameras to sort of make them worth the investment as opposed to having to buy a new camera every time. But I think the features inside the A1 will give it that longevity. I mean, the AI autofocus, the 4K, 8K video, the 40 frames readout. This is all in all a long-lasting camera. It's performing great and does make photographers and videographers' life a little easier, but it's just a great flagship camera overall. I think this camera has a long life in it. Now, if you're looking to get this camera, it's probably not an entry-level camera. As I said, it's a flagship camera, flagship pricing. That being said, easy to use if you're looking to get into photography, but it's definitely a more expensive camera. It's definitely something you're gonna get if you wanna take your photography more seriously or your videography a little more seriously. All in all, it is a great camera, but let me know what you think. Do you think this camera is worth the upgrade from the A1? What do you think of the upgraded features? What do you think of this camera in general? Let me know in the comments below.